Chapter 11. The City of Tents. For several days, to the sound of the caravan bells, we made our way through the margin of desolation, that wild, barren strip of soil with which the Emperor of Ar had girded its borders. Now in the distance we could hear the muffled roar of the mighty vosque. As the caravan mounted a rise, we saw spread far below us, on the banks of the vosque, a sight of incredible barbaric splendor. Pasongs of brightly colored tents, stretching as far as the eye could see, a vast assemblage of tents housing one of the greatest armies ever gathered upon the plains of Gor. The flags of 100 cities flew above the tents, and against the steady roar of the river, the sound of the great Tarn drums reached us. Those huge drums whose signals control the complex war formation of Gor's flying cavaliers. Talina ran to the foot of my Tharlian, and with my lance I hoisted her to the saddle so that she could see. For the first time in days her eyes were filled with anger. "Scavengers," she said, "come to feast on the bodies of wounded Tarnsmen." I said nothing, knowing in my heart that I, in my way, had been responsible for this vast martial array upon the banks of the vosque. For it was I who had stolen the homestone of Ar, who had brought about the downfall of Marlinius the Ubar, and who had set the spark that had brought Ar to anarchy, and the vultures below to feed upon the divided carcass of what had been Gor's greatest city. Talina leaned back against my shoulder. Without looking at me, her shoulders shook, and I knew she was weeping. If I could have, I would in that moment have rewritten the past. I would have selfishly abandoned the quest for the homestone, yes, willingly would have left the scattered hostile cities of Gor to face one by one the imperialistic depredation of Ar, if it were not for one thing, the girl I held in my arms. The caravan of Mintar did not camp as usual in the heat of the day, but moved on, attempting to reach the City of Tents before darkness. As it was, my fellow guards and I earned our pay those last few passangs to the banks of the vosque. We fought off 3 groups of raiders from the camps upon the river, 2 of them small, undisciplined contingents of mounted warriors, but the other a lightning strike of 12 Tarnsmen upon the weapons wagon. They withdrew in good order, driven off by our crossbows, and couldn't have seized much of the loot. I saw Mintar again, the first time since I had joined the caravan. His palanquin swayed past. His face was sweating, and he fumbled in his heavy wallet, taking out Tarn discs and tossing them to the warriors for their work. I snapped a Tarn disc from the air and put it in my pouch. That night we brought the caravan into the palisade, prepared for Mintar by Pakor, the master assassin, who was the Ubar of this vast, scarcely organized predatory horde. The caravan was secured, and in a few hours trade would begin. The caravan with its varied goods was much needed by the camp, and its merchandise would command the highest of prices. I noticed with satisfaction that Pakor, master assassin, proud leader of perhaps the greatest horde ever assembled upon the plains of Gor, had need of Mintar, who was only of the merchant caste. My plan, as I explained to Talina, was simple, and amounted to little more than buying a Tarn if I could afford it, or stealing one if I could not, and making a run for Korba. The venture might be risky, particularly if I had to steal the Tarn and elude pursuit. But all things considered, an escape on Tarnback seemed to me far safer than trying to cross the vosque and make our way on foot, a Tharlian through the hills and wilderness, to the distant cylinders of Korba. Talina seemed depressed, in an odd contrast to our liveliness of the caravan days. "What will become of me in Korba?" she asked. "I do not know," I said, smiling. "Perhaps you could be a tavern slave." She smiled wryly. "No, Tarl the Bristol," she said. "More likely I would be impaled, for I am still the daughter of Marlinus." I did not tell her, but if that was decreed to be her fate and I could not prevent it, I knew she would not be impaled alone. There would be 2 bodies upon the walls of Korba, for I would not live without her. Talina then stood up. "Tonight," she said, "let us drink wine." It's a Gorean expression, a fatalistic maxim in which the events of the morrow are cast into the laps of the priest-kings. "Let us drink wine," I agreed. That night I took Talina into the city of tents, and by the light of torches set upon lances we walked, arm in arm, through the crowded streets. Among those colorful tents and marketed stalls, not only warriors were in evidence, but tradesmen and artisans, peddlers and peasants, camp women and slaves. Talina clung to my arm, fascinated. We watched in one stall a bronze giant, apparently swallowing balls of fire, in the next a silk merchant carrying the glories of his cloth, in another a hawker of paga, and in still another we watched the swaying bodies of dancing slave girls, as the masters proclaimed their rent price. "I want to see the market," Talina said eagerly. And I knew the market she meant. This vast city of silk would surely have its street of brands. Reluctantly I took Talina to the great tent of blue and yellow silk, and we pressed in among the hot-smelling bodies of the buyers, forcing our way to the front. There Talina watched, thrilled, as girls, several of whom she had known in the caravan, were placed upon the large rounded wooden block, and sold one by one to their highest bidder. "She's beautiful," Talina would say of one as the auctioneer would tug the single loop on the left shoulder of the slave livery, dropping it to the girl's ankles. Of another, Talina would sniff scornfully. She seemed to be pleased when her friends were bought by handsome Tarnsmen, and laughed delightedly when one girl, to whom she had taken a dislike, was purchased by a fat, odious fellow of the caste of the Tarn keepers. To my surprise, most of the girls seemed excited by their sale, and displayed their charms with a raven gusto, each seeming to compete with the one before to bring a higher price. It was, of course, far more desirable to bring a high price, thereby guaranteeing that one's master would be well fixed. Accordingly, the girls did their best to move the interest of their buyers. I noted that Talina, like others in the room, did not seem in the least to feel that there was anything objectionable or untoward in this commerce of beauty. It was accepted, ordinary part of the life of a Gor. I wondered if, upon my own planet, there was not a similar market, invisible but still present, just as much accepted, a market in which women were sold, except that they there sold themselves, were themselves both merchandise and merchant. How many of the women upon my native planet, I wonder, did not with care consider their finances, the property of their prospective mates? How many of them did not, for all practical purposes, sell themselves, bartering their bodies or their goods for the world? Here on Gor, however, I observed ironically and bitterly, there was a clear division between merchandise and merchant. The girls would not collect their own profit, not upon Gor. I had noticed that there was among the crowd one tall, somber figure, who sat alone upon a high wooden throne, surrounded by Tarnsmen. He wore the black helmet of a member of the caste of assassins. I took Talina by the elbow, and though she protested, moved her gently through the crowd and out into the air. We purchased a bottle of Cullen wine and shared it as we walked along the streets. She begged a tenth of a tarn disc from me, and I gave it to her, and like a child she went to one or two stalls, making me look the other way. In a few minutes she returned, carrying a small package. She gave me the change and leaned against my shoulder, claiming that she was now weary. So we returned to our tent. Kazrak was gone, and my suspicion that he was gone for the night, and that he was even now tangled in the sleeping robes of one of the torch-lit booths of the city of tents. Talina retired behind the silk partition. I built up the fire in the center of the tent, not wishing to retire as of yet. I could not forget that figure upon the throne, he of the black helmet, and I thought perhaps he had noticed me. He may have even reacted. It had been perhaps my imagination. I sat upon the tent carpet, poking upon the small fire in the cooking hole. I could hear from a tent nearby the sound of a flute, some soft drums, and the rhythmic jangle of some tiny cymbals. As I mused, Talina stepped forth from behind that silk curtain. I had thought she had retired. Instead, she stood before me in the diaphanous scarlet dancing silks of Gor. She had rogued her lips. My head swam at the sudden intoxicating scent of a wild perfume. Her olive-skinned ankles bore dancing bangles with tiny bells. Attached to the thumb and index finger of each hand were tiny finger cymbals. She bent her knees ever so slightly, raised her arms gracefully above her head. There was a sudden bright clash of the finger cymbals, and, to the music of the nearby tent, Talina, daughter of the Ubar of Ah, began to dance for me. As she moved slowly before me, she asked softly, "Do I please you, master?" There had been no scorn, no irony in her voice. "Yes," I said, not thinking to repudiate the title by which she had addressed me. She paused for a moment and walked lightly to the side of the tent. She seemed to hesitate for a small instant. Then quickly she gathered up the slave whip and a leading chain. She placed them firmly upon the hands and knelt on the temple carpet before me. Her eyes were filled with a strange light, her knees not in the position of a tower slave, but that of a pleasure slave. "If you wish," she said, "I will dance the whip dance for you, or the chain dance." I threw the whip and the chain to the wall of the tent. "No," I said angrily, "I would not have Talina dance those cruel dances of Gor, which so humbled their women." "Then I will show you a love dance," she said happily, "a dance I learned in the walled gardens of Ah." "I should like that," I said. And as I watched, Talina performed Ah's strangely beautiful dance of passion. She danced before me for several minutes, her scarlet dancing silk splashed in the forelight, her bare feet with their belled ankles striking softly upon the carpet. With a last flash of the finger cymbals, she fell to the carpet before me, her breath hot and quick, her eyes blazing with desire. I was at her side. She was in my arms. Her heart beat wildly against my breast. She looked into my eyes, her lips trembling, the words stumbling but audible. "Call for the iron," she said. "Brand me, master." "No, no, Talina," I said. kissing her mouth. "No. I wish to be owned," she whimpered. "I want to belong to you, fully, completely, in every way. I want your brand, Tara the Bristol. Don't you understand? I want to be your branded slave." I fumbled with the collar at her throat. I unlocked it, and I threw it aside. "You are free, my love. Always free." She sobbed at me, shaking her head, her beautiful lashes wet with her tears. "No," she wept. "I am your slave." She clenched her body against mine, the buckles of the wide Tharlian belt cutting into her belly. "You own me," she whispered. There was a sudden rush of men behind me as a Tarnsman broke into the tent. I remember turning swiftly and seeing for the fraction of a second the butt of a spear crashing toward my face. I heard Talina scream, a sudden flash of light, and then we were in